Well, hello again, everybody. Another installment of Ministers Joe and Josh discussed. And
Okay.
it's a difficult passage that we're dealing with, but not like the last one. That last one with Judah and Tamar, that's about as dark as we're going to get. Now, it's not to say this passage is difficult, and it has some mature content, but not the kind of mature content we had in the Judah and Tamar story. So I think parents are perfectly safe with this one. Do you agree?
Yeah, if they're familiar with the story, they should be okay with it.
Yeah. And so we try to give you, if we have mature content, you can always read ahead. You'll know exactly, because we're not going to ever make the Bible more graphic than it is.
Right.
And we're going to try and tone it down best we can.
Right. Yeah. We want you to learn something from this. So if we offend you all the time, we'll have a hard time.
So we are in the story. Joseph has been taken down to Egypt, long trip. Do you want to say anything before we jump into the text?
Well, this is definitely not like Abraham, or Abraham went there and during a famine, or even when Isaac was tempted to go to Egypt. So we see Joseph being sold there. Probably you see a lot of these movies and such that kind of show when they sell slaves that they had to walk the whole way, and kind of a brutal transverse. And so, you think that, I mean, he's also a commodity for these traders to sell off. So they probably were trying to treat him as well as they could. We get a feeling probably he was 17, 18, maybe 19 years old by then. I'm not sure exactly, but in that range. So he was more in the prime, maybe of his biblical age, right? I don't know exactly, but
yeah, no, I think you've got him. I mean, it's tough to say. We're going to look at the clues in the text for his exact age, but I think the last time we saw, he's about 17, and I would imagine that's probably pretty close to where he is. Mm-hmm. And we'll just continue to remind folks who are situating themselves here. So this is the ancient world in biblical times, and you either have superpowers over here in Southern Europe or in what is today, Pakistan and Afghanistan and places like that. But you have the Assyrian Empire grew to power around here, Babylonian Empire down here. The whole region was the Sumerian Empire and Akkadian empires before that. The Hittites were up here, and the Egyptians are down here, and they're all trading with each other. And so that's essentially what was happening. We don't really know where the Midianite and Ishmaelite traders came from, but it was likely one of these superpowers. And these days, maybe the Hittites are in more ascension, so it's possibly more in Turkey. But they've come back to Egypt, and they're trading with the Egyptians. And it seems, and you've pointed this out, and that's the reason I wanted to go back to it, Minister Joe, there's a lot of thematic going back to the story of people leaving the promised land and going into Egypt. So that happened with Abraham. That Isaac was tempted to do it, but God told him not to. Joseph is sold into Egypt. Eventually, Jacob's family will come into Egypt, and they'll be slaves there for 450 years, and then they'll be taken out of Egypt. But then the kings of Israel keep wanting to go back to Egypt in rough times. And the thing that explains that is the Nile River. So the area of Israel is fickle when it comes to its rainfall. It's not exactly the easiest area to live in. You can't always predict the weather. People who live here in Syracuse would say the same thing, right? You can't predict the weather. But one thing you can guarantee in Syracuse is it's going to be wet. Mm-hmm. But you couldn't always guarantee that in Israel. There would be famines. There all through the history of the people living there are famines. One happens in the days of Elijah, one happens in the days of Abraham, one happens in the days of Isaac. It's going to happen again in the days of Jacob. So famines are common in this part of the world, but Egypt had a river that was sourced in the highlands in modern-day Ethiopia. And so there's a lot of stability in these days with that river. So the Egyptians, if anybody were hungry, you weren't guaranteed you were going to find food or water if you went north, because they could be just as fickle. But if you went south to Egypt, south and west, you could always find water. So we have a lot of that. And the Egyptians, because of that, were very influential. To this day, you become a powerful nation if you sit on a resource everybody wants.
Yep.
It's really why the Middle East is still important in modern geopolitics, right? Because they sit on oil fields. So the river there, the Nile, is a significant resource. And when things get tough, people go to Egypt.
Yep.
That's not why Joseph went there, but it is why the Midianites were going there, because it was a superpower and they were trading with it. Yep. So we're going to look at this story of what happens to Joseph when he's there. So far, I mean, let's recap before we read this. How would you explain Joseph's character, Minister Joe? If you had to tell somebody what he was like at the last point we saw him, how would you describe him to somebody?
Well, he seemed to be trying to win the approval of his father by making reports about his brothers and their abilities to run the business, should we say, of taking care of the animals, etc. Joseph definitely was
to say it less nicely, he was an informant.
He was an informant, yes. And whether he was an embellisher is something to be wrestled with too.
Yeah.
From what I understand from the text, there is maybe a potential idea that maybe he stretched the truth a little bit for his own flavor or favor.
Yeah.
And so the jacket of approval that his father gave him reflected that he was to be the one who was favored.
Yeah.
And so there was a good deal of resentment from his brothers. I mean, you can imagine being in a home, if you're a single child, you may not appreciate the dynamics of siblings, but Joseph definitely maybe stirred the pot with his dreams that he shared with his brothers and
would you
his
call him a
parents.
humble man?
Well, there's not a lot about him that really seems to be humble at all.
Not at that point, I think. Yeah, he's kind of spoiled.
Yeah.
You might call him a spoiled rich kid because Jacob is very wealthy, very prosperous for his day. That doesn't mean he doesn't work. Joseph clearly did work, but he's on the younger side, and most of his brothers seem to be handling the heavy lifting, right? So maybe a bit spoiled. Certainly, I'm thinking of, this is a short little rabbit trail, but it'll come back quickly. My favorite, one of my favorite Christmas movies is The Muppet Christmas Carol, and whenever I think of this, who Joseph is, I think of Ebenezer Scrooge when Miss Piggy, who's playing Bob Cratchit's wife, is insulting him at Christmas dinner. And she says he's odious, and her daughters are with her, and she says, and badly dressed, and they all go, and I think nobody would ever have accused Joseph of being badly dressed.
That's right. That's true.
He's a well-dressed man.
Oh yeah.
Isn't there a song, Well-Dressed Man?
I think it's Sharp Dressed Man.
Sharp-Dressed Man. Yeah, there you go. So he's well-dressed. He's his father's favorite, maybe a little spoiled, definitely a sense of entitlement. But as you said, we don't know that much about him yet because he's telling people his dreams, but we don't know what he thinks of those dreams. Yeah. Like one thing we didn't talk about in the last time we talked about Joseph is, why did he tell his family those dreams? Was he looking for insight? Was he looking for help? I kind of caricatured him as bragging, but maybe he wasn't. Maybe he's inquiring, what do you think these dreams mean? And maybe everybody thought they were self-evident enough. They thought he was bragging, but maybe he kept bringing them up because he wasn't getting any answers. It's easy to characterize someone based on, your own experiences. And in my experience, if somebody tells me how great they are, it's because they're looking for some accolades. But it's possible, right, that Joseph was being inquisitive. Yeah,
I mean, the thought comes to my mind as well, like you're saying. He might have been trying to interpret them, and so I mean, but they do sound like, those dreams do sound like something you could make up.
They do. And so it's possible they didn't even believe that he really had those dreams.
Yeah, like there's a dream that you have when you're sleeping, and then there's a dream that you have when you're sitting underneath the tree and eating your apple. You might so
yeah,
they probably didn't think that they were from God. They thought maybe that these were extrapolations potentially that he was making.
Yeah, daydreams of flights of fancy and so on.
Yeah. And so I think, if he was honestly seeking the answers to those, he probably, there would be more input or more.
Yeah. And one thing
More.
we didn't really talk about the last time, which is probably we should at least admit, is that dreams were not considered insignificant at this time or in this part of the world. And so focusing on one's dreams, especially when they are repeated, is a theme of Genesis. We certainly have seen that. We don't know really how God spoke with Pharaoh when he informed him that he had taken Abraham's wife and not just his sister. And we don't know how he informed Abimelech. But it's possible by dreams in this kind of a culture, especially since in the book of Exodus, God says that with most prophets, most people, he speaks to them in dreams and visions.
Yeah.
So people took these things seriously. So the fact that Joseph would take them seriously is not a stain on his character, because they
Right.
would have all taken them seriously. Of course, his brothers, as you said, thought that there was a different agenda behind sharing them. But we should probably be fair to Joseph. We don't really know his heart at this point. We just know how he was interpreted.
Right. Yeah. There's not much comment like saying, hey, God just told me these dreams. He doesn't say that. He doesn't even say it to his dad. And there's a kind of a clue where it says Jacob took these to heart. There's like a small throwaway phrase there, as if to say he thought that there was some truth to this. He just didn't know how or why.
Yeah, what it says about Jacob there sounds a little bit what will later be said of Mary when people talk about Jesus, and she says, and the Bible says she treasured up all these things in her heart. It may be similar to Jacob. You kind of lock it away. You realize this is important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we know, because we know the story too. It seems as though that there might be some forecasting going on.
Right. Yeah. And the natural way, I think we dealt well last time with the natural way you would read Joseph. He kind of strikes you as maybe someone who doesn't do the kind of work his brothers do. Maybe he's a bit of a tattletale, so maybe he has an air of superiority about him. He's talking about his dreams. Maybe he's a little arrogant. So you expect this kid gets sold into slavery, he's going to have a rough time. Right? That's what you would think.
He's got the soft hands.
Exactly. That's what you would think. And now, of course, we're going to get into the story now. We're going to find out that there's more to Joseph than we might have first anticipated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's just face it. If his dad prepped him for anything, for Egypt, I think he gave him some administrative skills.
Right. And Joseph does seem to display those fairly early on, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
So here we are. This is Genesis 39, verse 1. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, and do you even care how to actually say this? We're just going to keep it this way. I don't want to say Potiphar. That just sounds pretentious to me. We're just going to call him Potiphar. Is that okay with you?
That works for me.
An officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian. It's an interesting introduction there. Remember, we talk about why so many titles here. Potiphar, officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian. Those are all going to be important. Bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So apparently of the two, the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, it's the Ishmaelites who sold him.
Yep.
That's got to be important too, huh?
Oh, yeah.
The Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him an overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him an overseer in his house over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there, he had no concern for anything but the food that he ate. So let's stop there before we get into the sordid details of what comes next. So this introduction to which house Joseph was sold to seems in a text sparse with detail. We have a ton of detail here.
Mm.
You and I don't have to ask the question, who was Potiphar? Do you remember we had to ask that question about Rebecca's maidservant? Deborah. Who is Deborah? Like she
Yeah.
just appeared. But Potiphar, we get is like his whole resume.
Right.
We
Right.
know his relationship to Pharaoh, his job in Egypt, and his race. And that's not insignificant because not all people who lived in Egypt were Egyptians in these days. So there are people from the Middle East who live here, well, from Canaan and areas like that. There are people who are Nubian, who are coming from Africa, who also live there. There's even a period in Israelite history where they are ruled by a dynasty called the Hyksos, who are Canaanites who rule Egypt. And then there's a period in in Egyptian history where they're ruled by Nubians, by people from Africa, Southern Africa, or at least Central Africa. So to say that he lives in Egypt is not to tell you that much, but they want us to know he's also an actual Egyptian.
Mm.
Why do you think we need to know all that to begin with?
Well, I think to actually ground the ability of you would think a guy at this point, I don't know that he would be actually at the slave markets,
Right.
really looking for people. So they're showing it's really showing a transition from slavery into a prominent home. Unlike probably most slave trade, you would think,
Yeah.
going straight to the fields or whatever.
Yeah, he gets bought by a significant person.
Yeah.
Right away. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, God is in this. I think we're meant to see that God is in this. This is an unlikely purchase, and I think that's the point here. Like God brings him to the center of a significant house immediately and then gifts him. Now, you had said maybe Jacob gave him some administrative skills, but of course, last we saw Joseph, we didn't see very much of that, right? He was an assistant to his brothers, and the only administrative skill that I could see that he had was tattletaling. Which maybe that is a management skill.
Yeah, maybe.
What do you think, Minister Joe? But
at least evaluation.
He certainly didn't betray any of these significant gifts while he was still living in Canaan. But here he displays them almost immediately, but we're told why. Is this part of his natural gifting?
Well, there's always the idea of natural gifting, but there's definitely explicitly told here that God blessed him as long as he was in his household. So,
and we saw the same thing happen with Jacob. So what does that tell us about Joseph? I mean,
he's the new Jacob.
He must be the heir, right? He must be receiving the birthright and the blessing. Up until now, this has been the sign of that, right? Ishmael was not more successful than Isaac. Esau's not more successful than Jacob. So Joseph must be the heir. And it makes some sense because he's the firstborn of Rachel, though it still leaves the question of Leah's children. But it's no surprise to us that Leah's children are not cared for much by Jacob. But maybe somewhat surprising that the Lord seems to be choosing Joseph. At least that's the way it looks. Now, I'm setting it up that way because I think we're going to find out something different as we go, what God's plans are for this family. But at this stage, we have every reason to believe that Joseph is the new Jacob, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, definitely.
This is like Jacob in Laban's house, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, think about the travel Jacob took to get there.
And he went there with nothing, arrived penniless, and had to work for everything. I mean, in many ways, Joseph, it's a different story. Joseph has been sold into slavery, but Jacob accused Laban of treating him like a slave, right?
Yeah.
So they're having the same story here.
Yeah. And the Lord blesses him, just like Jacob was blessed.
Everything Jacob did turned to gold. He had the Midas touch. And the same thing is with Joseph, because God is with him.
Yeah.
So his work works. And here you got to say something about Potiphar, because Laban became jealous. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
Laban became jealous of Jacob's success, and he began to try and cheat him. Right? I think Jacob accuses him of changing his wages 4 or 5 times, right?
10 times.
10 times. But Potiphar's different.
Yeah, Potiphar is smart. He catches on quickly.
Yeah, he realizes, wow, this, if a rising tide lifts all ships, and this guy's the rising tide, I want him lifting my ship.
Right. Well, Laban's defense too. He did recognize it, but he used divination to figure that out.
Right.
And so I think there's some less kudos to Laban because he couldn't see the obvious.
Right. Yeah, Potiphar just realizes that everything's going really well. He doesn't feel threatened by Joseph, probably because he is an Egyptian and Joseph isn't. So that probably keeps some of the envy that would normally come up from being there, because Laban is not exactly a superior to Jacob, whereas Potiphar is a superior to Joseph. But he realizes that putting Joseph in charge of everything is just going to benefit him, so he does it.
Yeah. So do you think it's interpretive that the text is basically saying that Potiphar recognizes that the Lord is with him? Do you think it's just the successes, or do you think it's he actually can see like God working in his life?
I would be surprised myself if Potiphar recognized it was the Lord. But Potiphar, in my view, because I don't think the text ever says that Potiphar saw that it was the Lord, but we're told that it's the Lord helping him. And Potiphar sees the results. Potiphar, that's the way I read it, is that Potiphar sees how successful everything is going with Joseph in charge. And if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Yeah.
So the more he gives Joseph, the more Joseph succeeds at. And everything Joseph does works. So I think Potiphar, who knows? He's a spiritual guy. He lives in Egypt. They believe in a lot of gods. Maybe he thought one of the gods was favoring Joseph. I won't put it past him, but I don't think he knows who the Lord is.
So it's mainly his deeds or his.
I think so.
The Lord
that's
is
the way
blessed
most
him.
people. That's the way most people figure if somebody's touched or anointed, as they say in ministry, or gifted or whatever. They watch the results.
Yeah.
And some people, that's all they see. Now, Potiphar's right. There is something special about Joseph, but I don't think he knows what it is. But he's going to profit off of it.
He just sees the good of it.
I think so. I mean, do you agree? Do you think there's any chance here that Potiphar's becoming a follower of the God of Abraham because of Joseph?
No.
Yeah, me neither.
That's the easy answer.
Yeah, me neither.
But it's fun to think about that. Maybe God is stirring Potiphar, but we know that. I think we know because we know the story that that's not the case.
Yeah, I'm sure you have had the same experience as I have, that if you do something well, people will give you something else to do. But it's not because they necessarily think there's anything particularly special spiritually going on. They just think you're good at these things, so I'll give you more. And if it benefits them, they'll give you even more. That's what's happening with Potiphar, right?
That's what it seems like, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about the Ishmaelites, though? Is there any significance there?
Maybe we should. So there was confusion earlier on in the story, right? Is it the Midianites or is it the Ishmaelites? It goes back and forth. And you and I don't know if we ever settled on who we thought actually did the purchasing of Joseph, because it went back and forth. Do you remember what the text actually said?
I think at the beginning, I think it says when the boys, should we say, they were the brothers see a caravan coming, they call them Midianites. But I think as they're leaving, the text refers to them as Ishmaelites.
Yeah, so here's what it says. Yeah, you're remembering that better than I did. So they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming, and they said, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. But then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and then they sold him to the Ishmaelites.
Yeah, so maybe there was another transaction.
I don't know why mention the Midianites. It's a very interesting thing. But we wrestled around because, just so that people catch up, Ishmael, of course, is a son of Abraham by Hagar. Midian is another child of Abraham, but by one of his later wives after Sarah had died. So they're not the same groups, even though they look like they're being used interchangeably here. But it probably indicates to us that the other children of Abraham had united. And wouldn't you, if the special ones were uniting over here? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean,
so they're working together, but it's the Ishmaelites who buy them, and it's the Ishmaelites who sell them. And the Joseph story is clear that it's the Ishmaelites. And this is just an interesting thing. You know, if we go back to the story of Isaac and Ishmael, that now we have Ishmaelites purchasing one of Isaac's heirs and selling him to Egyptians. Because who was Hagar? What nationality?
Egyptian.
She's Egyptian. And so Ishmael and Ishmael married an Egyptian woman. So the Ishmaelites have these ongoing, it might be why the Midianites are traveling with them, because maybe the Ishmaelites had those better relationships with Egypt. But here we have Hagar's child selling Sarah's child. Isn't that you got to at least point it out?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was the opposite before, right? Hagar was Sarah's servant. But now now one of Sarah's children, her heirs, Joseph, belongs to the Ishmaelites. I mean, you're good to point that out. That's an irony that we shouldn't miss.
Yeah, and it's the breaking down of the 12 of Israel surrendering to the 12 of Ishmael.
Because Ishmael also has 12. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this, interestingly enough, Sarah's child has now become a slave in the house of Ishmael. And that little tidbit, I think, is somewhere in Paul's analogy in Galatians chapter 4, when he's talking about the son of the slave woman and the son of the free woman. And the way he talks about it, Sarah's children are actually children of the slave woman, which doesn't make any sense of Genesis until you read it close. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting observation. Yeah. So, the tangled web we weave.
Oh, yeah.
When we envy one another. Yeah. So anyway, the tables have certainly turned. The Ishmaelites now own the heir of Sarah. And then they sell it to the Egyptians. Yeah. There's a reason that we're reminded it was the Ishmaelites who did it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Would have been different if it were the Midianites who did it, because we don't have any real tales of their interactions with Isaac or with, that all happened after Sarah was dead, and we don't get a lot of tales about them.
But even envy, the envy of Cain, is what pushed them to sell their own.
I imagine the Ishmaelites knew the story, and they probably loved the idea of buying one of Jacob's children. So now Joseph is doing well. Potiphar recognizes it, continues to put him in charge, and now Joseph's star is rising a little bit, and he catches the eye of, someone who shouldn't have. So now the text goes on to say, now Joseph was handsome and good looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, with me here my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put everything that he has in my hand. He's not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, see, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and he's heard me raise my voice and cry out. He left his garment beside me and fled outside. Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you've brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. When his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, this is the way your servant treated me, he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. This is Chesed. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So when a star rises, it attracts attention. And Joseph was a good-looking guy, apparently. This is the first we heard of that. We knew he was a sharp-dressed man.
Oh yeah, he had the jacket, but not anymore.
But we didn't know he was a good-looking guy until now. But eventually the master's wife wants him. And, some people play around with the Hebrew, but it seems pretty clear what her intent was. Now, in our culture, we're more apt to think that men would do this, more apt than women. The Middle East has a very different opinion about that, always has. In fact, it's not uncommon in the scriptures to have women as the aggressors. And some think that's because it's written from a patriarchal perspective, but cultures do change. I've often said that men can be aggressive in our culture, partially because they're raised to believe that's what they are. And, the environment has some influence into how a person develops and what they think they're supposed to be. In the Middle East, women are painted this way much more frequently, and probably the temple prostitution that went on feeds that a little bit more. But suffice it to say, as different as this might seem in our culture, though I'm sure this happens in our culture as well, in the Middle East, this is almost a trope. It's almost an expectation that women will be the aggressors in infidelities. Today, it's the opposite. We think of men as primarily the aggressors. But anyway, in this day, this is not unusual. What I want to say is, in our day, we'd think, wow, this woman must be horrible. But in the Middle East at this time, probably run-of-the-mill pagan. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I think of something maybe a little different, but I'm not disagreeing with you or being disagreeable. I think immediately of the garden of the curse.
Yep.
Where it says that Eve would desire man, but he will master over her.
Yeah.
And so immediately I feel this tension here of Potiphar's wife almost being jealous of Joseph being in charge of the household. Now, oftentimes women are said that the home is run by them, or I'm not sure about the Egyptian culture back then, but the idea that I get a feeling of competition here. I'm not ignoring the fact that she's asking him to lie with her. I'm not ignoring that, but I kind of get the feeling of it pulls me back to that initial conversation or text about the garden where that is that case of.
So where's the jealousy, do you think, if you're reading it that way, and we certainly could, who do you think she's jealous? In what way is she jealous of Joseph?
I think she wants dominance over him.
That's possible.
That's my first initial is that to do this, I don't feel I feel like that's her case. It presents in a way. He was handsome. He's desirable, sounds sensual.
Yeah, that's the one that those are the introductory details that make me wonder if it's really about power, because you think his looks would be irrelevant if it were. But I can see what you mean. Sex in every generation is mostly about, when it's done outside of a covenant of marriage, it is even sometimes in a covenant marriage is often about power.
Yeah, it feels like she's jealous of his influence, even as weirdly as it may sound, influence over her own husband.
Yeah, I wondered if you were driving there, and I could go there too. There's a sense here that Potiphar has entrusted Joseph with absolutely everything and doesn't question him at all. And I can see how that would lead to some competition.
Yeah, and so I think this is the only way, in my opinion, to discredit him or knock him down.
So you
notch.
think it's entrapment? You don't think she really wanted him?
Well, I think it is entrapment. I don't think it was purely desire. I mean, because if she had that kind of power, and even if her husband didn't care about her at all, say she was unattractive to him, it was just a marriage arrangement,
Yeah.
It there's nobody gonna say that she didn't have the desire for him. I'm not gonna deny that, but I would say that there may be a sense of incompatibility that drives some of that. That's some of the psychology that we would use to excuse this kind of behavior.
Yeah.
But I really feel like the the real issue is power. I'm not sure that it's I mean there's obvious that
Yeah,
we
I
can
could
argue
see
for
that. The question you'd have to answer is why the writer of Genesis wants to highlight Joseph's sexual appeal if it's not about that.
Well, I think if we're going to follow the idea of Jacob's experience, there is that sense that there was an appeal for Rachel, even though he got Leah. So I think there may be a slight twist and parallel there. That could be pursued as well. But
yeah, I like this because you're reading it a little different than I do. But I think it's perfectly legitimate. I think it's perfectly possible that she is intending to have something over him, that there's a bit of a ploy. And maybe she was interested in having an ongoing affair with him, but she also had some measure of control. And if he ever got out of line or if she ever needed to use it, she's now got a trump card on him. And that is possible that she was scheming to that level. Now, my inclination is to read it as a glandular issue and less crafty and plotting. But it's hard to say. She certainly does use this against him when he refuses. But does she do that because she's been scorned? Or does she do that because she wanted him out and now she's found a way to do it? Like, is the plan going according to plan? Or is she just now upset and hurt and doing this out of spite?
Well, yeah, I think you could probably say that. But I think if she really wanted to have relations with him, we'll use that word, relations with him, she wouldn't have had to scream out because there was nobody there.
Right.
According to the story.
Yeah,
so,
there is an issue on why when she realizes he's not going to do it, why does she respond the way she does?
Right.
Now, I've often read this, though I'm hearing your way is perfectly possible. I don't know that we can say which is the better reading. I think you just have to deal with the details. But I figured that she figured Joseph would tell. And she figured she better be in control of the narrative. So my thought is that it had gotten so far that she figured this was going to come to her husband's attention. And she better be the one to come forward first, because the one who comes forward first gets to tell the tale.
Mm-hmm.
So because you notice she does that, she makes sure the servants know the story first. And I think that's my way of reading it, is she's protecting herself in case her husband hears of it from Joseph first. She'll have the corroborating story of these servants and she'll get to twist the narrative her way. So I take it as self-defense mechanism that she figures, I'm going to have to protect myself here. But it's possible this was all a scheme just to get rid of him, and it worked.
Yeah.
One way or the other. I don't know. I have to consider your way of reading it, because I guess that's not my natural tendency.
Well, I'm just throwing out some.
No, I like it. This is fun. You know, for me, I like the ideas. I like trying to get to the bottom of it. And I do think because this is Genesis, you've got an argument to make in terms of how the themes of the fall are being played out here. And it does. The curse on the woman is that she would have a desire for her husband, but he would rule over her. And we actually do see that played out here, because her desire is for Joseph, but he masters her. He rules over her. He refuses to give in. So that curse is played out here well. Mm-hmm. But she's not going to go down easily.
Yeah. It also references too that day after day she was trying to
she's trying to seduce him.
Yeah. Tempting him.
And of course she's also wealthy. She's a significant person. Maybe she's used to getting what she wants, and this is just a slave. We know slavery makes a person very vulnerable to these kind of assaults. In recent history, slaves were raped all the time. So, maybe all the time is an exaggeration, but it certainly feels that way with the stories that are told. So she might find it impertinent for him to deny her. She might have not even considered that he would deny her.
Yeah, but it says day after day, and he still would not. So I
she's insistent.
Right, right. And I think there's something to be said about Joseph's response, because it's as if it's specifically stated. I mean, he could, it's not like I don't want you. I have this position. I'm trying to protect your husband's household. He doesn't say that at all. He says,
No.
he basically says, why would I sin against God? And she's probably saying, which God you talking about? What could this possibly be? That you would.
Yeah, the two things I see here in his concern is betrayal. He doesn't want to betray Potiphar's trust. And he seems to think that that betrayal will offend God. Now, the question is, how does he know that? How does he know that an affair like this would be a problem for God? Is there anything in the story of Jacob or anybody else that would make him think that? Because he had firsthand experience of something like this.
Reuben?
Yeah.
Should we say Reuben?
He had first experience of Reuben. And it seems to me Jacob must have addressed this with him. Now, Jacob doesn't address it with Reuben, that we can see in the text, not until later. But it sounds to me like Joseph has the idea that these kind of sins offend God. And we have to ask that question, because people might think Joseph is just going by his guts here. God wrote a conscience on his heart. He just knows. But we have enough in the story to think Joseph probably got a little story about this from Jacob.
Yeah, I'm sure of it.
So he knows that this is a problem for God. But again, he's most concerned, it seems, because he gives her detail, like your husband's put me in charge of everything. He's given me everything, and I've cared for it well. Like he's talking about his own chesed, his own loyalty to Potiphar. And he's never abused the privileges that Potiphar has given him. That's what he's saying. And he's like, the only thing he ever kept from me was you. And I'm not going to betray him. That seems to be the sense that, and he thinks that betrayal of Potiphar would also offend God. And I'm guessing that relates to lessons he learned at his father's feet.
Yeah, I mean, they don't have the law, but they certainly can tell, just like Judah in the story before that was able to know that Tamar was more righteous than he was.
Yeah.
So there is some ethical coding that they're
learning as they go.
Yeah.
But there is some ethical, and you don't want to just make it all conscience. That's my thing, because it makes it sound like you can figure out God's will just by looking into your own heart. And I think the story indicates that these are repeated themes. Joseph knows this is wrong because of things that have happened, and it goes way back. He might have even known the story of Abraham and God's disappointment with the selection of Hagar. Maybe he sees his father's marriages and how his own mother interacted with Leah and the competition, and what happened with Reuben and how his father responded. And he's picked up the idea that you need to be a loyal person, you need to be trustworthy, and you can't take advantage of people when they're down. He's learned those lessons because we see them lived out in his family history.
Yeah, I mean, you could even argue that if Joseph was interpreting his dream properly, he would realize that this is going to be a temptation.
Yeah. And what I want to wrestle with, and what we are wrestling with, is how he knew this to be wrong, because we want to be clear. They don't have the law of Moses. He doesn't know that adulterers should be executed. He has the stories maybe that we have in Genesis up till now. Certainly, as you read the story, we're meant to believe that these things have been carried on, that somehow they've been passed along, but there's no way of knowing. So he's making this estimation. I just want to give him praise. Yeah, he's making this estimation with no clear teachings from God.
Well, I think he's handled it. He's dealt with it firsthand, though.
Right.
He's been betrayed by his own brothers.
He has. He knows what it's like to be in that vulnerable position. That's the thing. Joseph is learning good lessons from bad experiences.
Yeah.
and he guesses that this will be a sin against God. But we have to say in the book of Genesis, we don't know that. We could infer it based on the creation account of Adam and Eve. We could infer it based on the good relationship between Adam and Sarah and the faithful one between Isaac and Rebekah, that we could infer that these people have been instructed that they should not break their marital vows. But we don't have that clearly. Joseph intuits it, but he intuits it because of everything he knows about God. Like, this seems like a behavior that would be problematic for God. He doesn't even need the law to know that this would probably be problematic for God. And the thing that he points out is the betrayal of one's trust. He seems to already know will be a problem for God.
Do you think that he gets that from Abraham? Abraham story with Hagar? The very fact of being with the Egyptian woman, that's maybe why they talk about the Ishmaelites. Can we build an argument that way?
Maybe. I'm reading Genesis assuming information Joseph may not have had because we have it in Genesis, but the betrayal of trust is essentially what occurs in Eden, right? You were right to bring us there. God tells them what he wants and entrusts them with Eden, and he leaves. And then while he's not there, the serpent comes in and gets them to betray God's trust. And that's exactly what's happening to Joseph here. Now, does he know the story of Adam and Eve? I don't know if it's been carried along this far. But in the story of Genesis, it is. It's in our knowledge. So I think you have pointed us to Eden in a good way, because Joseph somehow this understanding has been carried on in the line of Adam, the line of Seth, into Noah, into the line of Shem, into Abraham, and all the way to Joseph, that to betray someone's trust is the essence of the fall from grace.
Do you think he maybe what I was getting at with Abraham, though, do you think he had been taught, and this is a subjective question, but
yeah.
do you think he may have been taught that Abraham having Hagar and then Ishmael was the actual, that's where I'm pointing to, is actually, would he be duplicating the same thing?
See, I don't think so, because there was nothing wrong with Abraham taking a concubine. In fact, he'll take two more after Sarah dies, and Jacob already has two himself, and there's no sense in the family line that there's something sinful about taking a concubine. And Hagar was not somebody else's wife, so he doesn't have a story of Abraham taking a wife from somebody else. So this is a bit unprecedented, meaning that Jacob's never tempted to commit adultery, and neither is Abraham, neither is Isaac.
Yeah.
So this is somewhat unique, but which I think is why Joseph is focusing on the betrayal of the trust of Potiphar. That he understands is wrong. Now, whether he knows it's wrong to simply sleep with someone you're not married to, Judah didn't know that was wrong, right? Judah's sleeping with prostitutes. But Joseph knows that because she's married to Potiphar, that makes this wrong. Now, eventually we're going to find out that it's wrong to sleep with anyone you're not married to, but that's not knowledge they have. But Joseph can still see that this is wrong, even if Judah couldn't see that sleeping with a prostitute was wrong, right? The sexual ethics, we're not saying that they're pure here, or that Joseph necessarily, like if this was another slave in the house who wasn't married, would he have resisted? We don't know. Because his presenting reason for knowing this is wrong is that it betrays the trust of Potiphar, trust placed in him. So again, we don't want to say that Joseph is pure as the driven snow and that any sexual temptation he would have been able to deny. We just saw what Judah did, right? We know the sexual ethics of this place, but he recognizes that betraying someone's trust in this way is an offense to God. And what I've been trying to do is track on how he might have learned that, because we don't have the law for him to learn it from.
Right.
He only has experience to learn it from. But that is a theme. And Joseph is able to be godly in his generation by resisting this. We don't know what he would have done had this been a prostitute coming on to him, the way that Tamar came on to Judah. We don't have that story. But this is Potiphar's wife, and he's entrusted in Potiphar's house, and he's not going to betray that trust. So this is really, I think, less about sexual ethics and more about chesed for Joseph,
Right.
more about his loyalty. And he
Right.
can't do it. And she doesn't understand it. And that's my thing. I think she doesn't understand it because she just doesn't understand it. Like, what's the big deal? She's Egyptian. Maybe this is no big deal there. But for Joseph, in his family line, chesed is becoming more and more important.
Yeah. Well, it becomes a big deal for Potiphar.
Oh, yeah. There's no question Potiphar's son is a big deal.
So
As the cuckold will.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and Potiphar believes his wife. What choice does he have, really?
None.
Yeah, he's got to believe her. But you wonder if he really believed her or not, or if this is just a political move on his part. But he believes her.
Yeah, I think he has to. Although
Would you believe her?
just not based on a coat, but
No, I think I would probably believe her.
you would, yeah.
I hate to say it, but I think I distrust men. He's a handsome guy. He's doing for a slave that I just bought from the marketplace. This guy has a whole lot of ambitious skills.
Yeah, but you'd think there'd be some more evidence.
Yeah. I know.
Struggle, a scratch, or
Right.
even if she fought him off, you'd think there would be some kind of evidence.
Yeah.
More so than a coat.
I still hate to say
It is interesting that it is a coat, though.
It is a coat. Yeah. This guy's getting this is second disrobing. And neither of them went well.
And they both represent something, though.
They do.
The evidence of power.
Yeah. In both cases, they're both used against him too. This is a good theme for you to pick up, and one that we shouldn't skip over. His coat, they drench it in blood and bring it back to his father and say, "Whose coat is this?" It's the same thing that Potiphar's wife does. Whose coat is this? And in both cases, used to draw the wrong conclusions. Jacob assumes he's been killed by wild animals, and Potiphar assumes that he's been unfaithful in his house. But given Joseph's status, his being a foreigner, it's not surprising me at all that Potiphar believes it.
Yeah.
And I'd like to think that I'd have better discernment, but I probably wouldn't.
Yeah. Aren't you surprised, though, that Potiphar doesn't use the Laban argument at all, though, for his own personal? I mean,
Like in what way?
Laban wanted Jacob to stay around for
Yeah.
But
well, this is a man's wife.
Yeah, I guess. What's more expendable, a wife or a guy?
This guy's a
working for him?
slave. Potiphar's done very well with him, but he's not gonna. If you were right at the beginning, and one of the things Potiphar's wife wanted to do was make him choose between her and Joseph, she got her answer.
Yeah.
And I think most husbands probably would side this way. And it's probably a cautionary tale to remind us that sometimes false accusations are made. And Joseph is, in fact, innocent. And he's been railroaded here. We should remember that. Because it is easy always to believe one who claims that they're a victim. And that's what I'm saying. I probably would believe it instinctively. But you have to push that aside and do some investigation. You wish that Potiphar had done a little bit more before he just tossed Joseph into prison. But it's probably a strategic decision on his part.
Yeah, and that part of the story may be compressed as well.
It could be. Maybe there was an investigation, but she went to quick work. When he ran out, he did run out naked. And she immediately called the servants. So it would have been hard. He's kind of literally caught with his pants down here. And another good reason to start wearing undergarments. Maybe he learned that later.
Yeah.
But he's a slave. Maybe he didn't have a lot of choice into what his garb was. So we haven't settled, between you and me, we haven't settled whether this was just a matter of lust And power, I certainly agree with you. It's power in the sense that she thought she could ask anything she wanted from whomever she wanted. And she didn't think that she thought resistance was futile, like to use the Borg from Star Trek's famous line.
Yeah.
So there's certainly an air of superiority and entitlement about her that she's using. But whether or not she was jealous of Joseph and wanted to take him down a peg, you and I haven't settled on which way we want to read that. It's possible. I don't know.
I think it was. I mean, sex is overrated, I think.
Yeah.
I think she might have been attracted to him, but I think it was all about power.
Yeah. Well, and we might say that is always there.
Mhm.
You know, it is always about vulnerability, control, possession for both genders.
Yeah.
So it's never absent.
I mean,
It's never absent. Why somebody wants somebody, it usually has to do with ego, power, control, possession.
or they thought
That's not what it's supposed to be. That's not
Yeah.
what marriage is supposed to be, but it does seem that it's more commonly that.
well, maybe it was kind of a game for her in some ways too, because
Yeah, like a mouse, a cat playing with a mouse. That's probably how she saw it. That's what I do agree with you. That's probably how she saw it. I'm just not sure it was motivated by jealousy because Joseph was so well liked by her husband. It's possible. That's where I'm not sure. I'm with you with the power stuff. I just
Yeah.
don't know if what motivated her was her loins or jealousy. Or you could say both, but I think the text puts loins first by talking about his desirability. But it's possible that jealousy was there too, and she wanted to see her husband choose between them.
Yeah, or it's spite too. This makes a good story too, with the idea that all these titles given to the husband in the beginning, presumably in my mind means that he's gone a lot.
Yeah,
and then he gives
he's given all those titles to Joseph more or less.
Right. Yeah. So to me, an argument could be made, like even in our culture where there's an absentee dad, or a husband that's not home a lot, the woman begins to feel lonely, or the woman feels abandoned.
Yeah, and then the question is she just looking for a little diversion, or is she trying to get her husband's attention? You're leaning to the husband's attention, and that's possible. I can't say that that's not right. But I do think that given the way the story is told, I agree with everything you've said about Potiphar's distance, maybe her loneliness. Those things are all possible. I think Joseph was desirous to her. He's a slave, so she should have power over him. He shouldn't resist. She can do what she wants. I would be surprised if he did it, if she ever told her husband. I would be surprised if she did. Yeah. But she would have had it over him, no question. And anytime Joseph stepped out of line, she could have used it. So she definitely would have had a trump card. So I'm with you on that. I just don't know if that was the motivation. Sexuality is supposed to be a covenant renewal, a covenant making, covenant renewing behavior between a man and a woman who have bonded to spend their lives together to create a home and to raise children. That's what it's for. But the worldly mind uses it as a tool of exploration, a tool for pleasure, a tool for power, a tool for influence, a tool even to interact with the gods, which is where when it occurs in pagan temple worship and things like that. It's treated as some sort of something that we've been given we can use, and we're going to use it how we want to use it.
Yeah.
And we see Potiphar's wife treating it that way. We don't know what Joseph thinks about sexuality in general. We just know that he knows it's not a good idea to betray your boss.
Yeah. Well, there aren't very many good examples prior. I mean, immediately prior to this passage of sexual relations. I mean, we're talking with Judah, we're talking with Reuben.
Yeah.
Where
even Jacob and the concubines and his wives and all that, who even knows how his kids process that whole thing? Dad's in a different tent every night, being bought with mandrakes. I mean, how in the world did they process any of it?
Right. And there seems to be a dramatic lack of spiritual insight to that at
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
in that portion.
The curse between man and woman
Yeah.
seems to have disrupted the wonderful poetry of the original creation.
So it's amazing that he's even able to make this statement.
Yeah. Yeah. Astounding. And like I said, he tells us, the text tells us the reason he makes this choice, and it's to keep from betraying his master.
Mhm.
It's really not a comment on Joseph's like purity or whether or not he is he thinks of sexuality as he should. We don't know any of that. We just know that he understands chesed, and he understands that this would be a breach of loyalty, and he can't do it.
Right.
Yeah. And there are plenty of examples of that. Actually, of all the things Jacob has, he has a lot of chesed.
Mm-hmm.
He's pretty loyal to Laban, even when Laban's disloyal to him.
Mm-hmm.
And he works his tail off, and he's faithful to what he says he'll do. So Joseph, probably the chesed part, we can see why he valued that.
Mm-hmm.
But sexuality, this is not a story about Joseph's sexual ethics. It's a story about his chesed.
Mm-hmm.
But we learn a little bit about Potiphar's wife's sexual ethics.
That's right.
Yeah.
She's part of the mainstream story there.
She is. So her husband believes her story, and I can hardly blame him. I don't even think with an investigation it would go well for Joseph. He was in and we have to remind ourselves, when we have someone working for us, they are in a vulnerable position a lot of the time. And we need to be appreciative of that, because Joseph here he's at her mercy. Whatever story she tells, he's going to be stuck with it because he's in her employ. He's alone with her, and he has no ability to not be alone with her. He's a slave in this house. She can arrange everything. So he is absolutely trapped. And we should at least not move on past this before we remind people who are in positions of power how much responsibility they have to care for the people in their employ, because these people are trapped. We heard all these stories coming out just a few years ago, right? About executives with locks on their doors and the ability to tell people they have to work late and have to meet them alone, or they have to meet with them in their hotel rooms. We've heard these stories coming out of Hollywood and Wall Street and all kinds of places in recent days. And it's the same thing Potiphar's wife is doing. She has that kind of power over Joseph. She's taking advantage of it.
Yeah.
And he is powerless. He's innocent and has no way to defend himself. So, we have to leave it to God to judge her.
Yeah.
There's nothing
Definitely.
Joseph can do.
Right.
And it's abominable. And anybody who reads the story and doesn't realize how monstrous it would be to be in her position hasn't really read the story.
Mm-hmm.
People who have power like this, they have a lot of responsibility. And I hesitate. I don't even hesitate to say they're going to have a lot to answer for. But does God abandon him?
Nope.
No. I mean, he's not working for as prestigious a guy as he was, but same results.
Yeah. Well, he got a transfer. He was the he's got a transfer. He went from the captain of the guard to the captain of the prison guard.
Right.
It's just a transfer.
Just a transfer, and God blesses him just as much in jail as he was blessed when he was the head of Potiphar's house.
I mean, but he's not going to get the temptation from Potiphar's wife in there.
No. And who knows? The temptations he faces in prison are not really detailed. And I'm sure there are other opportunities to misuse his position there, just like there were in Potiphar's house. But Joseph is proving to be a man of deep chesed, of deep loyalty and steadfast faithfulness. And he's now evidencing that in less than ideal circumstances. Whereas before, maybe we could have said it was in his best interest. Maybe it is still in prison. It's probably a good idea to be the favorite of the boss wherever you are.
In prison, yeah, big time.
Yeah. But Joseph he's carrying out his duties with faithfulness, right? And the Lord is blessing him. So he has exactly the same story as told of Joseph in prison as was told of him in Potiphar's house. Right? It's a repeated story.
Yep. Similar again to Jacob. Comes in low position, rises to a high position, and it's because God is with him. There's that
God is with him.
The repetition. So this would be the third time he's been knocked down.
Yeah.
And then lifted up.
That's right. Yep. And we're learning now, Joseph is growing as a person through this. We know he is, because each time he won't exactly be the same. And we need him to take a journey, because the last time he saw his brothers and the next time, there's going to be quite a difference in his ability to hurt them.
Mm.
And we're wondering who he's going to be as a person next they meet. And this is part of that journey.
Yep.
But Joseph has been humbled. You said knocked down. He's been humbled. He's been humiliated.
Mm.
First time he's stripped of his humble button that he kept wearing, and sold in slavery. And then he's sold by Ishmaelites to the Egyptians, and he becomes a slave in a house in Egypt. That's another rough moment. And then he's accused falsely of betraying his master with his wife, and he gets thrown into prison. So he's taken his lumps, and it's
Right.
public.
Oh yeah.
He's like publicly humiliated all these times. If he had any pride, it's not going to survive this stuff.
Yeah. The tough things about it, and oftentimes people will talk about his attitude through that, and we really don't know much of his attitude through that.
No, you're inferring most of that. But what can we say? What can we say solidly about Joseph?
Well, he definitely was blessed by God. There's a connection there that even in difficult times, even in those difficult times, God still was blessing him, and other people recognized it. It wasn't like there had to have been some fruit to it.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just like some internal thing. Well, I can psychologically just say,
Yeah.
God is with me. I might be having the hardest time of my life, but God is with me.
Yeah.
Kind of self-therapy. Whereas,
well, it reminds me of the Star Wars movie, Rogue One, one of the prequel things that they've done, since Disney bought it and decided they were going to make as much money out of this thing as they could. And there's this guy there who keeps saying, the Force is with me, I am with the Force. He keeps saying that, and early on, you don't really believe it. He keeps saying it, but there's no fruit. But eventually he does this amazing battle scene, and you go, I think the Force is with that guy.
There's the proof. Proof's in the pudding.
And it's the same thing with Joseph, right? I mean, you can tell yourself God's with you all you want, but it does have to bear some fruit. Yeah. Thankfully for us, the fruit that's supposed to be born is the fruit of the Spirit and not success at business. But for Joseph, it was success at business.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, the measurable abilities to succeed in this environment had to be something physical.
Right, it had to be.
I mean, you would. But
there is something internally going on with him too that we can say for sure. We can't say how he processed any of this stuff because we're not told any of that. But he does. He is chesed is growing in him. He remains faithful to whichever master he's placed under. Right? He's faithful to Jacob originally, at least as far as we can tell. When Jacob told him not to talk about these dreams anymore, he didn't. Mm-hmm. Right? And he goes where his father tells him to go. He's submissive to it. His father says, go look for your brothers. And it's not an easy journey, right? He goes all the way to Shechem by himself, still can't find them, figures out where they are, and he finds out that they're in Dotan. Now, he could have just gone home and said, oh, Dad, they're in Dotan. That's a long way. I figured. But Jacob told him to find them. So he went to Dotan. And that faithfulness to Jacob lands him a slave to the Ishmaelites. And then he's faithful to Potiphar, right up to not cheating with his wife. And I still believe that if he had cheated with his wife, he would have kept his job. But he refused, and that got him sent to prison. So his faithfulness is really smacking him in the face. You'd think at some point he'd say, I'm done being loyal to these people. I should never listen to Dad. Why in the world did I want to respect Potiphar? Look at what I got for my trouble. Now I'm in prison. I'm going to live for myself. That's what you would imagine, but not Joseph. He's going to be faithful to the jailer. Like Joseph refuses to learn the lesson that his faithfulness is a waste of time. Like he refuses to learn that lesson. He stays faithful, even though it keeps getting him knocked down. And so now he's faithful to the jailer. And we'll see what happens, right? That's the next part of the story.
Yeah. But he succeeds, and they still use the same phrase again, that the master, whatever Joseph was over, the master doesn't have to worry about it.
He takes care of it. He's a faithful man.
So that's part of what it means to be loyal, is that right. People can put their trust in you, reflecting back to the garden again,
Right.
where it's showing that even though we live in a cursed world, that this is something to be rewarded.
And we see a shadow of Jesus, who is faithful even unto death, even when the faithfulness doesn't benefit him, only his employer,
Right.
who is God in Jesus' case. He does it.
Mhm.
And so Joseph is a shadow of that, without a doubt, because his faithfulness to Potiphar lands him in prison. Had he been unfaithful to Potiphar, he might have extended his stay in his household, but he refuses. It's the same thing that Moses, later will be said in the New Testament, that Moses did not consider the pleasures of evil of Egypt as something to indulge, but instead he rejected it and chose to be one of his own people, right? That it's the same story, you know.
Yeah.
Loyalty sometimes doesn't work out for your benefit. But here I want to say, this is, for me, this tendency to stick with what he believes to be true despite the consequences, seems to me that this is where Joseph is most like his father. And it tells me that Joseph, probably of all the brothers, spent the most time with his father, because this stubborn characteristic of Jacob that makes him a God fighter, you know, and a heel grasper, you know, the fact that he dukes it out and refuses to be turned back, his rugged endurance, I see it in Joseph. And you
Yeah.
don't see it in his other sons quite the same way, but we also know that he wasn't spending time with those other sons.
Right.
I think here Joseph looks most like the heir of Jacob to me.
And beginning to build the should we say the idea of legacy, even despite the difficulty. Legacy, what I mean by that is the actual
why
blessing.
Why is Joseph going to remain faithful to the God of his father now? It seems like a waste of his time to do so. I mean, what benefit is it to being loyal to God when you're in Egypt? But Joseph will not let go of God the same way that Jacob wouldn't let go of him when he was wrestling with the angel. You know, Joseph just is tenacious and holding on. And that will be blessed, but boy, not right away.
Yeah. Well, the things of it that his brothers are doing aren't necessarily being the blessing of God.
No. Joseph is, but again, Joseph had his father's favor. Joseph he had a different relationship with his dad than his brothers did. And you can see it. He's carrying on at least some of the ethics that have been carrying on in the line of Abraham. But his brothers seem to have none of those ethics.
Yeah. Well, it is, if we're talking about Jacob, what his name actually means, Joseph is living it out.
Yeah.
So that if we're going to talk about the purifying or the building of character.
That's a good point. The deception of Jacob's sons, that is the one way that they reflect him. Joseph has his tenacity and his chesed. All the rest have his duplicity. I guess our kids inherit some part of us. Maybe that's why we're supposed to be disciplined in interacting with them, so they don't pick up only the bad parts.
Yeah.
But it's a reminder that the kind of father Jacob was to Joseph, he really should have been to his other sons. But he wasn't.
Right.
You know, and tough.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to learn here. And so the last verse, and this is where we'll need to end today, the chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper.
Yeah. So what does that really look like in a prison?
Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea what it looks like to be successful in a prison. It doesn't even tell us. Do you think it's because it expects us to know, or because it doesn't matter?
Well, I think in our day, people would try to say that prison is supposed to be a place where there's a hope for rehabilitation.
Yeah, prisons though are different, and it's probably important we didn't say this at the beginning. It would come up more naturally next time when we talk about the cup, when you talk about the cup bearer and the baker being thrown into prison and why they're put there. We're told that this is specifically a prison for the king, for pharaohs, the kings, prisoners. You don't have prisons in the ancient world the way you do now, where anybody caught with an infraction has to serve a certain amount of time in some sort of facility that's run by guards and things like that. These are special condition prisoners. It might even indicate that Potiphar carried some doubt as to Joseph's guilt, that he wanted to keep him alive. Because this is for special prisoners. This is where people who had offended the king were placed when he hadn't yet decided what to do with them. And so we'll find that out with the baker and the cupbearer. Pharaoh hadn't decided whether to execute them or not. So he puts them in this prison temporarily. And then when he makes his decision, he takes one of their heads and puts the other one back in his place of service. So it is possible that Joseph's being placed here is the only indication in the text that Potiphar might not have believed his wife.
Yeah, that's why
he probably would have killed him otherwise.
that's why I was referring to the transfer.
Yeah, he got transferred. So again, this is not usually a life stay. That's my point in these prisons. You're usually here until the person in charge decides what to do with you. So it is, we didn't say it. I would have next time if I was with you with the cupbearer and the baker. But Potiphar had to believe his wife, but probably didn't believe her. And so he lets Joseph live in limbo. This is kind of like The Princess Bride, your favorite movie. Remember when Wesley is spared by the dread pirate Roberts? He tells Buttercup the story. He says, every day he would train me, and at the end of the day, he'd say, good work, Wesley, most like to kill you in the morning. That's probably the life Joseph had. Because there's only one way out of, there are only two ways out of Pharaoh's prison. Reinstallment where you were, or death.
No, for that.
So we'll most likely kill you in the morning.
That's right.
And so Joseph just stays there, and everything's going as well in the prison as it was in Potiphar's house. So maybe Potiphar's keeping eyes on him and realizing we probably shouldn't take this guy out.
Right.
Let's just keep him there in limbo and see what happens.
Yeah. So it's not to say that Joseph was a good executioner, though.
No, I don't think the prison guard, he's only the assistant to the prison guard. I don't think they're executing anybody.
Yeah.
They're just holding Pharaoh's special prisoners.
Yeah. I think he was.
But it's an interesting place to be held because only very important people are going to be held in this prison. So Joseph probably does interact with a lot of people who are somewhat significant, and maybe a lot of them didn't make it out of there alive, but some of them maybe did, like the baker did. Baker? No, the cupbearer.
Cupbearer, yep.
Cupbearer makes it out. And that's really what saves Joseph. So, it's a pretty significant thing. And, I probably should have mentioned, and I'm glad you brought this back, that Potiphar is merciful by putting Joseph in Pharaoh's prison. He would have had to get special permission for this. I wonder what he said to Pharaoh to get permission to keep one of his former slaves in Pharaoh's prison.
I think he probably said, hey, I know a guy who really ran my house really well. Do you need a guy to help run your prisons really well? Get the truth out.
Right. Who knows? But yeah, this is a bit of mercy, though.
Yeah.
That he's here, and he's here for a long time. So I'm all about movies today, Minister Joe. If you've ever seen The Man in the Iron Mask, do you remember that?
I don't know that I've seen it.
Yeah.
I know of it.
Leonardo DiCaprio. But anyway, in that case, he's a prisoner in the king's special prison because he is the king's twin brother. And the king doesn't want to kill him because you don't want to kill this guy, but he also doesn't want anybody to know who he is. So it keeps him in an iron mask. And Joseph is kind of that way too. This is a special prisoner. Yeah.
Well, let's face it. He's safe from Potiphar's wife.
He is. And Potiphar doesn't have to kill him. And, thinking about this now, maybe what you said at the beginning, that Potiphar had some sense that there was a God behind Joseph's success, that might indicate why he's in this prison. Maybe Potiphar was a little afraid to kill him.
Yeah. Well, that things may go badly for him. Maybe
right.
he might have used him as a consult,
right.
Continued that relationship, but now Potiphar has a little bit better control over his wife.
He does. And Yeah, so it's an interesting story in a lot of different ways. And obviously, Joseph is caught up in a lot of politics here. And we've just been exploring what those politics might have been. But for Joseph, he's faithful. He executes his duties as expected and goes above what is expected of him. And the Lord blesses him. And he is the best servant Potiphar ever had. And then he becomes the best assistant the jailer ever had. And he's going to eventually become the best second in command Pharaoh ever had. Yep. So Joseph is living out what we see in the New Testament when you remember it says slaves obey your masters as unto the Lord, and not only when they're watching you, but even when they're not, so that God will be glorified. That's a hard teaching for us today because we don't like the language, but Joseph lives that out. He's as faithful to Potiphar when he is watching as when he's not. And he's as faithful to the jailer when he is watching and when he's not. And he'll be as faithful to Pharaoh when he is watching and when he's not. Joseph is one who can be trusted with responsibility. And Jesus told a parable about that, I think. The one who is trusted in a little will be trusted in much. Do you think that might be a summary of the story of Joseph?
It might be, as long as you don't get cut down and then start all over again like that. I think that's what.
Well, sometimes that's the only way to know how trustworthy you are, is for everything to be taken away.
To be tested, at least.
That's what happened with Job.
Yeah.
You know, none of us know if we're only being trustworthy because things are going well.
Yeah.
How would we be if the walls fell off, if the wheels fell off and the walls fell down and everything went bad? Would we still be faithful? Are we only not stealing because we can pay? Would we steal if we couldn't pay? Like, sometimes you don't know how deep your character runs until it's truly tested. And we're getting a sense of Joseph as being tested, and he's passing these tests.
Yeah.
But he's going to face the ultimate test, because there's no test as sweet as vengeance.
That's right.
So that's going to come too. And then we'll find out who Joseph really is.
Yeah. One more comment about the prison, though. I mean, with all these people who were influential that would be in that prison.
Yeah. Or at least people close to Pharaoh.
Can't help but think that maybe this became, should we say, the college experience for Joseph?
Yeah.
Where he's being exposed to the culture, to, I mean, even at Potiphar's house too, but this is the political, the servant, the people that are all around Pharaoh, to understand that, you know, maybe it could have been the minister of agriculture or anything you could think of in that prison at one point or another, where it would be an education for him.
Absolutely.
More so than if his brothers were just to show up to buy food.
Right. I agree with you. All of this prepares him to lead Egypt.
Yeah.
This is the Lord uses this as a educative experience, and all of us could treat our suffering in similar ways.
Yeah. Well, I used to describe or talk about experiences as like a tapestry. You probably have heard of that analogy, where you have these things and these experiences that network, that become part of the fabric of who or represent who we are, our experiences, and often are preparing us for, I believe, preparing us for future service or servanthood.
Yeah.
And I tend to feel like this is maybe an illustration of that.
I agree. And God knew exactly where he wanted Joseph to be. So he also knew exactly where he had to be to learn those lessons. So it's interesting how God turns what Potiphar's wife meant for evil towards good, and not just good for Joseph. This little turn where they send him into Pharaoh's prison, probably the only place in the country he could have risen to Pharaoh's right hand from.
As a Hebrew slave.
As a Hebrew slave. By getting him thrown into prison, not only is Joseph eventually redeemed, but Egypt is saved from a famine, and Joseph's whole family is saved. The whole region is saved. So God really does take what was intended for evil and turn it to good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there probably was another road to Pharaoh's right hand that could have been walked had people been holier, but it's another example that the wicked cannot. They can send maybe God's person in another direction, but they can't ultimately stop the destination if we keep staying faithful.
Mhm. Yes.
So I think you're right. He went to college, the college of Pharaoh's prison.
Yep.
And he learned. I mean, obviously he was a good administrator from the beginning, but he was able to administrate all of Egypt. And Pharaoh's going to take advantage of Joseph's successes too. And I won't get to talk with you about that story, Minister Joe, at least not like in this forum. But Pharaoh uses Joseph's success to buy up all the land in Egypt and become the sole owner of all the property in the land. And so inadvertently for poor Joseph, he ends up manufacturing Pharaoh's takeover of the whole country. And that's not going to go well for the Egyptians in the future. But, even when God blesses a person, sometimes they take advantage and do the wrong thing with that power. It's
That's
not
right.
Joseph's fault that Pharaoh does that.
Right.
But Pharaoh requires it. But
Yeah. Well, it becomes part of the catapult to get them out of there anyways.
yeah, because eventually Pharaoh's power gets so centralized that we end up with the confrontation between Pharaoh and Moses.
Yeah. I think probably prior to that, most people probably think that Egypt was a one nation under Pharaoh.
Yeah, it wasn't.
But it's not the truth, right?
And I mean, as I read the history, what I'm pointing at, and it all depends on when you think the date of the Exodus was. We won't get into that. I'm going with the biblical dates because that's my assumption, though I know that scholars don't agree with the biblical dates. But in any case, according to the biblical dates, with the history of Egypt, this regime that Joseph is ruling under gets overthrown. And it might be because of this buying up of all the property and the centralizing of power and the exploitation through the famine and all that happens. But another group of pharaohs seems to be in charge later. And those are the pharaohs who don't know Joseph. And that precipitates in the slavery of the Israelites and their increased bondage. Mm-hmm. So anyway. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for your patience, your loving kindness to us.
And keep reading.
Keep reading.